In the history of warfare, few battles have been so devastating that they transformed the very soul of the victor. The Battle of Kalinga in 261 BCE was one such conflict, a bloodbath so horrific that it turned one of history's most ruthless conquerors into a champion of peace and human rights. Emperor Ashoka the Great stood at the pinnacle of ancient power. By 261 BCE, he ruled the vast Mauryan Empire that stretched across most of the Indian subcontinent, from Afghanistan in the west to Bengal in the east. He commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and controlled trade routes that brought wealth from across the known world. But there was one prize that had eluded Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta, and his father, Bindusara: the independent kingdom of Kalinga on India's eastern coast. Kalinga occupied a crucial strategic position along the Bay of Bengal. Its ports controlled maritime trade routes to Southeast Asia, and its territory served as a corridor between northern and southern India. More importantly for Ashoka's imperial ambitions, Kalinga's continued independence represented a challenge to Mauryan authority that he could not tolerate. The kingdom of Kalinga was no minor principality. It was a prosperous, well-organized state with a strong military tradition and fierce pride in its independence. For generations, Kalinga had successfully resisted absorption by larger empires, maintaining its autonomy through skilled diplomacy and determined resistance. The Kalingas were renowned warriors who knew their homeland's terrain intimately. Their armies included war elephants, skilled archers, and infantry trained in guerrilla tactics that could make any invasion costly. They had fortified cities, a loyal population, and leaders who preferred death to submission. When Ashoka's ambassadors arrived demanding Kalinga's surrender, King Ananta Padmanabhan's response was defiant. Kalinga would never bow to foreign rule. The kingdom would fight to preserve its freedom, regardless of the odds. Ashoka's reaction was swift and merciless. He assembled the largest army in Mauryan history, over 400,000 infantry, 100,000 cavalry, and thousands of war elephants. This massive force represented not just military might, but the accumulated power of one of history's largest empires. The Mauryan war machine was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Ashoka's armies included soldiers from across his empire: Afghani cavalry, Punjabi infantry, Bengali archers, and southern Indian warriors. They were equipped with iron weapons, sophisticated siege engines, and tactical knowledge gained from generations of conquest. But this wasn't just about military superiority. Ashoka was determined to make Kalinga an example that would discourage any other region from resisting Mauryan rule. The campaign would demonstrate the futility of opposing his empire. When the Mauryan army crossed into Kalinga territory in 261 BCE, they faced immediate resistance. The Kalingas had prepared for this invasion, implementing a strategy of strategic withdrawal combined with harassing attacks that would bleed the invaders while preserving their core strength. Kalinga's defenders used every advantage their homeland offered. They poisoned wells, destroyed bridges, and turned their own cities into fortresses. When forced to retreat, they left nothing useful for the advancing Mauryans. The war quickly became a brutal affair. The Kalingas fought with the desperation of people defending their homeland, while Ashoka's forces showed the ruthless efficiency of a professional imperial army. Neither side offered quarter, and civilian populations found themselves trapped between two merciless military forces. The decisive confrontation came near the Kalinga capital of Tosali. Both armies committed their full strength in a battle that would determine the kingdom's fate. Contemporary accounts describe a conflict of unprecedented scale and savagery. The battle raged for days across the coastal plains of Kalinga. War elephants crashed into infantry formations, cavalry charges shattered shield walls, and archers darkened the sky with arrows. The sound of combat could be heard for miles. The clash of weapons, the trumpeting of elephants, and the cries of wounded and dying soldiers. Ashoka personally led his forces, fighting alongside his men and demonstrating the warrior skills that had made him master of an empire. But the Kalingas fought with equal determination, knowing that defeat meant not just political submission, but the destruction of their way of life. As the battle reached its climax, superior Mauryan numbers began to tell. The Kalinga army, despite its courage and skill, couldn't match the resources Ashoka could bring to bear. Kalinga's formations began to break under the relentless pressure. When King Ananta Padmanabhan fell leading a final cavalry charge, Kalinga resistance collapsed. The surviving defenders retreated to their fortified cities, but the kingdom's field army had been destroyed. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt. What followed was a systematic campaign of destruction that shocked even the ancient world. Ashoka's forces moved through Kalinga like an unstoppable force of nature, capturing city after city and crushing any remaining resistance. The siege of Tosali was particularly brutal. When the capital's defenders refused to surrender, Ashoka ordered a direct assault that breached the walls and led to a massacre. Soldiers, civilians, and anyone associated with Kalinga's resistance were killed without discrimination. Contemporary sources describe scenes of unimaginable carnage. Streets ran red with blood, entire neighborhoods were put to the torch, and the screams of the dying echoed through smoke-filled cities. The Mauryan army showed no mercy to anyone who had opposed their emperor. But the true horror of the Kalinga War went beyond the battlefield casualties. Ashoka's forces systematically destroyed Kalinga's infrastructure, burned its libraries, and enslaved much of the surviving population. The kingdom that had proudly maintained its independence for centuries was being erased from existence. The numbers, even by ancient standards, were staggering. According to Ashoka's own inscriptions, over 100,000 Kalinga soldiers were killed in battle, 150,000 people were deported as slaves, and countless more died from starvation, disease, and the destruction of their communities. Modern historians estimate that the total death toll may have exceeded 300,000 people, an enormous number for the ancient world. Entire bloodlines were extinguished, cities were left empty, and fertile lands became depopulated wastelands. For Ashoka, the conquest of Kalinga represented the completion of his imperial ambitions. He had succeeded where his predecessors had failed, bringing the last independent kingdom under Mauryan control. His empire now stretched from sea to sea, and no power in India could challenge his authority. But victory came with an unexpected consequence that would change not just Ashoka, but the course of world history. In the aftermath of the conquest, Ashoka toured the devastated territories to survey his triumph. What he saw among the ruins of Kalinga would haunt him for the rest of his life. The emperor who had ordered the destruction found himself walking through cities filled with corpses. He saw mothers weeping over dead children, elderly people dying alone among the ruins of their homes, and survivors wandering aimlessly through the wreckage of their civilization. According to his own accounts, Ashoka experienced a profound spiritual crisis as he contemplated the human cost of his ambition. The man who had commanded armies to show no mercy was confronted with the full reality of what that mercy's absence meant. Standing among the corpses of his enemies, Ashoka underwent a transformation that defied every expectation of ancient kingship. The conqueror, who had built his empire through violence, was overwhelmed by remorse for the suffering he had caused. In a move that shocked his contemporaries and puzzles historians to this day, Ashoka publicly declared his conversion to Buddhism and his commitment to the principle of ahimsa, nonviolence toward all living beings. This wasn't merely a personal spiritual awakening. Ashoka fundamentally restructured his empire around Buddhist principles, creating what may have been history's first systematic attempt to govern according to ethical rather than purely pragmatic considerations. The emperor who had once ruled through fear began promoting compassion. He established hospitals for both humans and animals, created a network of roads and rest houses for travelers, and sent Buddhist missionaries across the known world to spread teachings of peace and tolerance. Most remarkably, Ashoka had his transformation and its lessons carved in stone across his empire. These edicts, written in local languages and scripts, represent some of humanity's earliest declarations of human rights and governmental responsibility. In these inscriptions, Ashoka explicitly acknowledged the horror of the Kalinga War and his remorse for the suffering it caused. He declared that conquest through force was inferior to conquest through dharma, moral law, and religious duty. The impact of Ashoka's transformation extended far beyond India. His missionaries spread Buddhism to Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and even the Mediterranean world. The religion that emphasized compassion and nonviolence began its journey to becoming one of the world's major faiths. Under Ashoka's rule, the Mauryan Empire became a laboratory for governance based on ethical principles rather than mere power. He established laws protecting animals, promoted religious tolerance, and created institutions designed to serve public welfare rather than imperial glory. The contrast with his pre-Kalinga rulership couldn't have been more dramatic. The same man who had ordered the systematic destruction of an entire kingdom now prohibited the unnecessary killing of even insects in his palace kitchens. Ashoka's edicts also established principles that wouldn't be seen again in government until the modern era. He declared that all people, regardless of their social status, deserved protection under the law and access to justice. He promoted religious tolerance and declared that all faiths deserved respect and protection. The Battle of Kalinga thus represents a unique moment in human history, not just because of its scale and brutality, but because of its aftermath. Rarely has a military victory led to such a complete moral transformation of the victor. The war that was intended to complete Ashoka's imperial ambitions instead ended his career as a conqueror. After Kalinga, he never again launched a war of aggression, focusing instead on internal development and the spread of Buddhist principles. The irony is profound. Ashoka achieved his greatest historical significance not through his military conquests, but through his rejection of the very violence that had made those conquests possible. The emperor remembered today as the Great earned that title not for expanding his empire, but for transforming how that empire was governed. The Battle of Kalinga reminds us that even in the ancient world, the human cost of warfare could provoke profound questions about power, morality, and the responsibilities of leadership. In a world where might typically made right, Ashoka's transformation represented a revolutionary idea that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to choose compassion over conquest. The bloodied fields of Kalinga gave birth to one of history's most remarkable experiments in ethical governance, proving that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought within the human conscience.